One death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. This is a quote often attributed to Joseph Stalin, who, on his own, based on his communist philosophies, caused the death of millions and millions of people. And for some reason, this particular effect seems to hold true, that if we're dealing with one death, we can find that sympathy or empathy, and we can really appreciate the weight and the value of that life. However, when we get to the point of it being tens of thousands or millions of people that are killed, we can't fathom it, and we just move on, or we just ignore it. This is the case as it stands with abortion in America, and this is how we are left to deal with it. And I know you're probably sitting there thinking, we just keep talking about abortion. I'm tired of talking about abortion, but it is important. And the reason it's important is not just because from my side of things and from God's side of things, it's really important to talk about life and the value of human life. It's important because the other side of the aisle in politics has deemed this important. They have deemed this one of the big issues that will define the next election, the midterm 2022 election. And this isn't coming from me. This is coming from them. They continue to make this an issue, and so we have to respond to it. And we have to understand what is really, literally at stake. And this is one of those life and death issues. It's one of those issues where we are either saving or killing literally millions of babies. We're going to look at some of the numbers later, but I just want you to hold tight. We have a story today that I find heartwarming and compelling and wonderful, but maybe not for the reasons that most people think. We're going to look at this story of the New York Police Department, who found a pair of twins killed in an alley, which is, again, tragic. What they did, however, was give them a funeral. And it's a wonderful story. We're going to look at that today and why that makes a difference and why it really gives the whole game away, that people understand what a human is and the value of a baby. I'm Matt Odegaard, and welcome to Church Public. Well, again, welcome to Church Public. I sincerely appreciate you stopping by today. I know you have plenty of other things that you could be doing, so your time is valuable. It's valuable to me, and it's valuable to God. So I appreciate the time that you are spending on this today. There's just a lot going on in the world, and there's many things going on with the border crisis. There's still stuff going on in Afghanistan that I want to get to, but today I really think this is a super important issue, and it's important because not just important to me, it's important to God, because as I keep saying over and over again, human life has eternal value, and we have to act like it does. As believers, if we believe that God is real, if we believe that God is in our life, if we believe that this really is something we can get behind, then we really have to make this on the forefront of what we deal with too. And I know it's hard, and I know it's a difficult issue, and I know it's a contentious issue, and that makes it difficult to deal with, both in the public and the private sector. But as I mentioned in the intro, this is something that the politicians are making a big deal about. You have the Texas bill. Florida has just started a bill that is very similar to the Texas bill that bars abortion after about 6 weeks. There probably will be other states. I hope there will be other states that do similar things. And then you have the federal government led by the head, President Joe Biden, who has said specifically that they're cracking down on the state of Texas, even suing the state of Texas, using the full weight of the Department of Justice to bring back what they ostensibly claim is women's constitutional right to abortion, which, of course, as we've noted in the past, doesn't actually exist. There is no constitutional right. It is not in the Constitution. You can go and look it up yourself. Again, don't take my word for it. Feel free to check that out. But what I want to look at today is this story that I came across of some New York police officers. I'm going to put it on the screen. If you're not watching, you can go to churchpublic.com and grab the video. But if you're listening, I certainly appreciate you listening, and give a like and a review and a share. All right. So this story is heartwarming, and I certainly love it. This is, if you're not watching, it says cops arrange funeral for dead twin newborns abandoned in a Bronx alley. So this is New York Police Department, and it really is wonderful. It's wonderful what they did, and it's wonderful how they stepped up to aid these poor little babies that were left to die or murdered. We don't really know. I read through this article, and there's just not a lot of information here. If you're not watching, again, you can see these wonderful police officers holding This tiny casket, my goodness, this is just heartbreaking. It really is. Like it's what you want to see and yet don't want to see, right? Because every life is, in fact, precious. And then I'll just show a couple more here. This is them loading it into a hearse. Pastor, I believe, on one side with his hand over his heart, mourning, and then the officers actually saluting the sweet little babies. And I just love that. And then finally, I'll get one more picture for you. This is them lining up in parade formation around the hearse, sending these sweet little ones home to Jesus. And so here's the deal, right? The reality here is that I think this story is illustrative of what we inherently know. I reported the other day that you had certain celebrities, certain even a Democratic House representative who said she personally had an abortion and still feels bad about it to this day. It gives the game away. Why would you feel bad if this is just a medical procedure, if it's just a clump of cells, if it's just a tapeworm parasite that you just pass in the night and doesn't make any difference? Of course, that doesn't make any sense. And we know that doesn't make any sense. But I think this story is really important to illustrate that unfortunately, this statement that attributed to Joseph Stalin that we read before, that one death is a tragedy and a million is a statistic, is something that we just cannot wrap our heads around. And this is a little bit, I don't know how to wade into this. It's like you have to cannonball into this because it just hurts. It hurts your heart. It hurts your sensibility. And I love seeing that this New York police department stepped up into this and said these babies deserved more. They deserved a life. They deserve a funeral. They don't deserve what they were given. But the reality is every single one of the babies that are killed through abortion deserves this same thing. And that's the problem that we run into. We drive by these abortion clinics and we go on to our dinners and hang out with our friends and don't think twice about it. In reality, there are babies being killed there as we speak. And it's hard to wrap your head around that. And the reality is, if we really understood the significance of each human life, each baby's life, we would want to do more about it and we wouldn't be able to deal with it. But the reality is we can't comprehend the loss and suffering that's going on. And just for reference, I just pulled this up a moment ago, that this is in New York City. According to a local nonprofit, there are around 289 babies that are killed by abortion every day, just in New York. And I looked up just some other statistics here that there are so many that we it's hard for us to really understand the fullness of what's going on. So the total number of abortions in the United States between 1973 and the Roe versus Wade decision that we've been talking about until today is somewhere in the 60 plus million. And the reality is that number doesn't account for the abortion type pills and abortifacients and things like that probably are in the tens of millions beyond that, because those are not procedures that are performed in these places, so they're not recorded. And I'm just gonna not do any more statistics at this point, because again, we get into this place where we can't comprehend the fullness of what's really going on here. And I think it's important just to really focus on these poor babies, and we really just need to focus on how do we deal with this and what is going on in our world that we really can't comprehend on this type of scale. But it still makes a huge difference, and we still really have to focus on what can we do? What can we do to change this? And I do want to continue just talking about why this matters, because you're probably sitting there and you're tired and you're like, he always talks about abortion. That's the only thing he talks about. And I do talk about it a lot, but that's because I think we haven't talked about it enough in our communities, in our families, in our churches over the past several decades. And so we've gotten to this point. We've gotten to the point where we think Roe is settled. We fall into this lie, this idea that the left is pushing, that this is just settled science, it's just settled law, and the reality is it's not. It's not law. It's never been voted on by any legislation. It has only gone through the Supreme Court and set a precedent, which even at that is a really slim precedent at that. It's not based on anything actually constitutional. Again, don't take my word for it. Go and look it up. This is not in the Constitution. It's only in the Supreme Court decision. And that's why this matters so much right now. And there are two sides. Of course, it matters because of the Christian perspective. And hopefully my Christian perspective and God's Christian perspective on this is clear by now. I mean, we can continue to talk about we can go all the way back to Genesis. In Genesis 1, when God says, be fruitful and multiply, within that command, of course, is the idea that don't kill babies when they're born. You're supposed to be fruitful. You're supposed to multiply and have children. That's part of it. We talked about Proverbs the other day, that children are a blessing. There are a bunch of Proverbs that talk about how children are a blessing. And then one of my favorite stories is actually the story of Jesus, when Jesus... when he's in his mother's belly, in Mary's belly, and Mary goes to see the other Mary, his cousin, Elizabeth. Sorry, Mary goes to see Elizabeth in Luke 1. And I'll just read this for you. This is Luke 1:39-ish. In those days, Mary arose, went with haste to the hill country, to a town of Judah. She entered the house of Zechariah, greeted her cousin, Elizabeth. And when Elizabeth heard the greeting of Mary, the baby leapt in her womb. Again, Jesus and John are having this moment in their mom's bellies, like kicking. And if you've ever been around a person who's been pregnant, you know that the babies kick. And this is another thing. I'm a man, so I'm not supposed to be able to talk about that. We looked at Pelosi's really weird statement the other day that because she's had a bunch of babies, now that gives her priority to be able to speak on other people killing babies, which again, as I discussed, is a logical, like, backwards thinking. Like, if you've had a bunch of babies and you appreciate all the babies you've had, your argument should then equal, so have babies because babies are a blessing, which she says babies are a blessing. But her conclusion is, I've had babies and they're a blessing, so you should be able to kill your babies. All of this just doesn't make any sense. But we get to this point where this is something that's important politically, and it's important politically because they have made it important politically. And as I mentioned, the bigger issue is religion. And we'll come back to this again and again because this is really the point here. The bigger issue is religion, and the bigger issue is that this is their religion. Their religion is a secular humanist religion in which they try to prolong their life as long as possible. The whole idea is to prolong life. And the idea is you get to choose however you live your life. And the ultimate choice is taking someone else's life. This is the direct juxtaposition between Christianity and this weird political, secular, humanist religion that a bunch of people practice in America. And a bunch of people are wailing and crying for. Literally, you can watch these videos of people wailing and gnashing their teeth, I would say like demons, because they don't get to have abortions on demand, free and clear, up until the very point of birth. And this gets to the very point. You, at the same time, have representatives who said they have had abortions. You have celebrities who said they have had abortions that have helped their career. And yet, they say at the same breath, but they still feel bad about it. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that they still feel bad about it. And the reality is here, in the Christian perspective, obviously that babies have eternal value. And in the Christian perspective, just to take a step back from it, the ultimate sacrifice was paid by Jesus when he, as the fully representative human, stepped into his role of dying to himself. He chose himself to die for you, for me. This opposite religion, whatever you want to call it, humanist, secularist, political, scientific, says the opposite. It says you should be able to sacrifice someone to kill them so you can live and so you can have your best life, right? That's the opposite thing. Jesus says, I will die for you so you can have life. This new religion, it's not new, but this religion that is immensely popular, apparently, in America is you should be able to kill someone so that you can live. I'm going to say this over and over again because I want you to understand the difference, because all of these euphemisms paint over it, and you have women's choice and women's health, and you have the right to choose and constitutional rights and all of these things. And you have this new law, not law. Sorry, I apologize. It's a new law. This is the new law. This is the Women's Health Protection Act. This is the euphemism that this new House law goes under, the Women's Health Protection Act. That sounds fantastic. Who doesn't want women's health? Of course, we would vote for women's health. That is not at all what this has to say. This bill is basically lifting every restriction off of abortion. What about the half of people, little babies, that are women? In what way does this Women's Health Protection Act take care of, protect the half of babies that are little baby women, girls, women? Like, it doesn't. These are the euphemisms that they want to cover over. Oh, it sounds great. Yes, we want to protect women's health. Let's do this. Everybody chant together and it'll be great. That's not what this does, and we have to call it out. We have to understand it. That's why I keep coming back to this. And we have to be able to say, no, this isn't right. It isn't right that you get to, for your own reasons, choose that another person is going to die. And this gets into all kinds of other things, death penalty. How can you be for saving babies but for killing criminals? And again, I'll get into that in another episode, but that is not in any way the same. If you do an action that causes bodily or terminal harm to another person, according to justice standards, biblical standards even, in many cases, you should deserve the death penalty. And that's not according to me. That's biblical justice. In fact, in the Bible, there is no prison system. We have that now as an idea to create a more empathetic or sympathetic or rehabilitative environment. And the effectiveness of that could be questionable. We can talk about that again at a later time. But those things are not at odds to say that there should be justice for those that commit atrocities, and there should be justice and protection for those that are innocent. Those things are exactly correct. You want to protect the innocent, and you want to punish or find justice for those that are at fault. This should be obvious to everyone, but for some reason, and the reason really is because they've obfuscated, they've confused this whole issue with weird and flowery rhetoric that it makes it really difficult for the average person to say, oh yeah, like I'll give you an example, and this is a kind of silly example, but I'm going to give this example to you and you can take it. And I don't watch late night comedy shows anymore because I'm just going to say, functionally garbage. So you can hate me for that, but they're just not funny anymore. I like watching things that are funny, and every late night comic at this point is not funny anymore. They just make quote unquote jokes to make people clap that are politically charged. Check my work on this. I have not heard a funny joke on any of these late night shows for a long time. But in the past, there were some funny jokes. Here's one that they did, and sometimes you see this man on the street, right? You've heard about a man on the street, and they go out, and you interview somebody and say, do you believe in this? Do you want this? Blah, 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 whatever. They did a really great, what I thought was hilarious, man on the street. And this will illustrate my point if you stick with me for a moment. The man on the street went out to various people, and it was in New York, just going back to New York. And they said, and they set up a thing and said, stop women's suffrage, stop the suffering of women. We just want to end it. We want to end women's suffrage. We want to end the suffering of women. And if you're paying attention right now, you know what just happened. So here's the deal. A bunch of people signed up and said, oh yeah, we don't want women to suffer. We want to stop the suffrage of women. Of course, I will sign this petition, like whatever, we'll sign this petition, stop the suffrage of women. We want to stop women's suffering. Because women's suffrage sounds like women's suffering. However, if you know your history, if you know politics at all, women's suffrage is not about women's suffering. Women's suffrage was the march to allow women the right to vote, which is very important, and they absolutely should have. But because euphemistically it sounds about the same, and some people don't exactly know what some words mean, right? That's, I guess, the nicest way I can put that. It fooled a lot of people. The same thing is going on here. And this is the important thing to note. When they say we're going to pass a Women's Health Protection Act, that sounds great. Of course, who doesn't want to protect women? That is not what's going on here. And we need to continually remind ourselves and others, hey, I know you think this is a good thing, but it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing to kill the innocent. It never has been, and it never will be. There is no universe in which God can condone the killing of babies. There's no universe then for us as believers, as followers of God, that we should be able to condone the killing of babies. There is no, you can hear me clearly, hopefully. There is no circumstance in which that is okay. There is just none. I'm sorry, I won't be proven wrong on this, because this is a penultimate principle. It's the highest principle of life, is to allow innocent life. I know you'll sit there and say, well, what about rape and incest and all these other things? It's not the baby's fault that these things happened. That's the thing. Who is innocent in this situation? Yes, there is a victim in this situation. Absolutely. And I can have compassion for that. It is most terrible. And that's where we get back to this idea of justice. The person who perpetrated that should be at least locked away forever. Forever. There's no like 5-year sentence. No, forever. Or sent to death. I have no problem saying that, because that is an irrevocably terrible act of injustice on another human. However, who is the innocent person in this? The child that was conceived is not at fault for this. And while circumstances may be terrible, there's no situation where you can tell me that the child deserves to die because of someone else's problem. And this is where we get to this New York Police Department story. We come back to this story and say, see, this is why this story is important, because when you get to this place where you can understand that these officers had the right idea. They understood that finding babies thrown away in an alley is the worst thing that a human can do. It is just so terrible. And these poor babies need to be taken care of, and someone needs to love them and care for them. That is why I love this story so much, and that's why we have to remember that this story is important, and we have to keep in mind that in our hearts, while this is really hard to consider, it's really hard to think about, it's really important that we continue to bring this stuff up, and we continue to live with the fact, live in the difficult, broken world, that this is a hard world, and yet we have to enter into it. We're not called to go hide away in a church and hide away on a mountain and not engage with the world at all. This is one of the things that the world says is a really important thing. I'll read you a couple of things from the New York Times, because this is not just a fringe sect or weird cult that's saying we need to kill all babies. This is mainstream American politics. That's why this is so important. The New York Times writes, this House vote is largely symbolic. Again, this is about the House vote on the Women's Health Protection Act. It's largely symbolic, given that the bill, the Women's Health Protection Act, has little chance of advancing because of Republican opposition in the Senate. Again, that's true. It probably won't pass the Senate, but that is why this shows clearly how political and symbolic this is. They go on to say, quote, House Democrats' decision reflects their view this issue could resonate strongly in the midterm election next year, particularly if female voters see the Supreme Court action as a threat to rights many believed have long been settled, end quote. This is the thing. This is the thing the politicians are banking on. They're banking on both the coasts, but middle America. They're banking on suburban housewives saying, this is a right we have, this is a right we need, therefore we need to fight against the Supreme Court saying, or you can't actually have a right, there is no actual constitutional right to have an abortion, which of course there is not. But that's beside the point, because in this instance, culturally, these elites, these politicians, these celebrities think and say, you do have this right. It is given by the court or the Constitution or wherever they're getting this right. And this right should be protected. Again, we talked about rights on another time. You can go back and listen to that at churchpublic.com. But our rights come from God, and they come from the Word of God that we have. They don't come by just some weird elected official saying these are the rights we have. Yet the culture has shifted so much from the Ten Commandments, the words of the Bible, the morality of God. Now we're at this point where the rights are going to come from whoever is the loudest or has the most power or most money or whatever. And this is a really bad place to live in, because whoever is the loudest or has the most money or the most power setting the laws creates these really weird laws, which is why I began the show with Stalin. Stalin was the loudest and had the most power and was able to enforce things that caused the death of tens and tens of millions of people through these communist policies. We are looking literally at an equivalent here. And I hate to even say that, but that is the reality. We're looking at the equivalent where these types of policies already have caused the death of tens of millions, upwards of 60 plus million babies. And if policies like this go through, which is what these politicians are banking on and want to happen and believe a large majority of the country also are in favor of, then they will have their way. And it goes all the way to the top. And it's important to note this, that Biden, the commander-in-chief, the White House statement said, quote, "The administration looks forward to working with Congress as the Women's Health Protection Act advances through the legislative process to ensure this bill codifies and is consistent with the protections established by Roe and subsequent Supreme Court precedent. The constitutional rights of women are essential to the health, safety, and progress of our nation. Our daughters and granddaughters deserve the same rights that their mothers and grandmothers fought for and won, and that a clear majority of American people support. We will not allow this country to go backwards on women's equality," end quote. Again, that is coming from the very top, from the White House, and it's important to note these things and take notice that this is what the White House wants to do, this is what the legislators want to do, this is what the celebrities want to do, and they're banking on the fact that when this vote comes through in 2022, there's a bunch of suburban housewives that also want this as well. And we have to have our facts straight. We have to understand how to talk about this. We have to understand that this is a really difficult topic. It's a topic that is heartfelt. It's a topic that causes a lot of emotion. And I totally understand that from the fact that, again, going back to this New York story, the story is the important thing. The story is that babies deserve to live. They deserve to not be treated like these poor babies were treated. And yet, that's what these people are calling for. They're calling, these politicians, the president, these celebrities are calling for babies to be treated like they are inhuman and don't matter. And yet the evidence, the spirituality, our very hearts point to something different. And we need to keep that, as difficult as it is to stay in that brokenhearted zone. We have to stay there because it's not for our sake. It's for the sake of these babies. Thank you for listening to Church Public today. I certainly appreciate it. I hope that you check out some of the other episodes on this and many other things. And I do promise that we'll do some other topics coming up from here. I hope that God continues to bless you and keep you as he makes his face shine upon you. And I hope, as always, that you will keep the faith.